Well, welcome to another interview held by EFSAS. And this time we have with us Mr. Timothy Foxley, who first and foremost is an EFSAS Research Fellow. But apart from that, he's an independent consultant specializing in political and military analysis and research. He currently lives in Malmo in Sweden. He has worked for the British government as a defense analyst for over a decade. He has studied Afghanistan, the region, and associated conflict teams since 2001. Much of his time he has spent as at the UK Ministry of Defence, where he received an MBE, which is a member of the British, British Order Empire.
well, yes, we could talk about the Great Game straight away. It's an MBE, which is a member of the British Empire.
British Empire. Okay, so the colonial terms.
It's not the most modern of terminologies, I have to admit.
No. You've also worked for the Swedish Ministry of Defence and for the well-known institution think tank, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, better known as SIPRI. Currently, or recently, you've also engaged in providing expertise on Afghanistan to UK lawyers defending Afghan asylum seekers, and in addition, you have broadened your canvas by also engaging in studies of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and Russia-related security teams. I'm sure they must be coming in handy at the moment. The Russian security teams. And you've also done two operational tours in Bosnia during the 90s when it was at war. So, Mr. Timothy Foxley, welcome.
Thanks, Junaid. But call me Tim. It's only my mother calls me Timothy when I've done something wrong.
Well, as the viewers might have guessed, this is going to be mostly about Afghanistan, but we're going to give it a bit of a twist that we all know the situation in Afghanistan since Taliban's takeover, the security situation and the human rights situation. So I personally thought that delving too much into that is nothing new. We're mostly going to talk about its regional impacts and its historical relevancy. But before we come to that, as we always start off, how come, Mr. Foxley, you, as someone from London originally, end up being an Afghan expert? Where does this come from?
Well, Junaid, I mean, I know I've studied Afghanistan for over 20 years. I still struggle with the word expert. I mean, it's such a diverse, complex subject, and I've come in at one part of the history of Afghanistan, and it'll move on when I'm long gone. But I mean, first of all, thanks for having me. I mean, I've seen some of the interviews that you've hosted, and I've seen the array of people that you've interviewed. So I'm humbled and privileged to be asked to be in the same forum as your previous speakers. I've wondered when I looked at some of your speakers, I wondered if I'm maybe the only person that didn't choose to study Afghanistan. It very much came to me by accident, and this is, I mean, as I've thought about this over the years, it's one of the problems that we have in international relations and in conflict security issues, that when a crisis comes up in the world, the world is not necessarily ready for it. And the day before 9/11, at that point in time, I would have considered myself a Russian analyst, studying the Russian army, the Russian ground forces. And before that, I've been looking at wider European, Eastern European issues. I've been, as the Balkans, as you said, I've looked at Eastern Europe, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union countries, and the selection of conflicts connected with that part of the world. So before 9/11, I mean, I knew a little bit about Afghanistan. I knew that the British tended to go there and get defeated and have to retreat. That's my crudest understanding. I knew the term "the Great Game." I didn't really know the depth depth of it. And I came into this environment by accident after 9/11, and I suspect, why I know, that a lot of Western and American analysts found themselves in the same situation as me. We hadn't chosen Afghanistan. You know, it happened. You know, Bin Laden, 9/11, and suddenly weeks later, you know, in every analytical kind of capital in Western Europe, everyone's going, who's the Afghan analyst? Do we have any? And the answer is no, we didn't. I mean, we had if you were lucky, you had some South Asia analysts looking at India, Pakistan. There were some, I guess, like counter-terrorist groups, particularly the Americans and the CIA, who were looking at this Bin Laden chap who'd embedded himself with his history of supporting the Mujahideen in the 80s. He was now in Afghanistan, you know, plotting, but you know, that was more the counter-terrorist side. So when 9/11 happened, and suddenly the world's spotlight was directed onto Afghanistan, there wasn't much expertise on Afghanistan. There's the CIA long-term counter-terrorist, Bin Laden, Al Qaeda bit, but for the rest of us, kind of, you know, inverted commas, normal analysts, there was no expertise. And I was, and this is really important to understand the West's response, not just the British and the Americans, but how the West dealt with this situation, because, as we know, it didn't go very well. You know, 20 years of effort and blood and treasure and such like, and it's worked out terribly. But so we had no Afghan expertise. I was summoned one day and said, you're now doing Afghanistan, and this would be October 2001. And I said, okay. And I reported to someone's a very good friend of mine now, my boss, and said, I'm apparently studying the Afghan ground forces, because I had that sort of background from the Balkans, you know, Bosnia. And he said, okay, that's great. You're the only one we have at the moment. And I said, well, I better start looking at the files, you know, reading up, you know, like any analyst, you want to dig into the files, you know, immerse yourself and work out which way is up. So I said, I'd better start looking at the files then. And he said, what files would they be then? And I said, surely we have some files on Afghanistan. It's been a bit of a theme for the 80s and the 90s. You know, surely someone's been studying it. And he said, no, not really. It's as he said it, you know, for all that time, it was someone else's war. There was no British involvement. We didn't have any troops there. We had an embassy, but that pulled out. So there was no background reading that I could do. So my first exposure to Afghanistan was an extremely painful learning curve. And I can show you. I've primed my prop here. This is the first book that I got. No, actually, I tell a lie. I always say this is the first book. It's not. The first one I got was Michael Griffin, Reaping the Whirlwind. But they were out at more or less the same time. But this is the one that it's well thumbed and battered and such like.
Are you really saying that in October 2001, the UK Ministry of Defence had almost nothing to read on Afghanistan?
I am pretty much saying that, yeah. And I in the context, as it was explained to me, in the context I can understand it, because it was someone else's war. I mean, it's not fair to say there was no one looking at it at all, but it was a very narrow resource priority. You know, analysts are constantly overstretched. Mm-hmm. There are different priorities in the world, as we can see with Ukraine. Russia has taken all the attention from Afghanistan. And I'm sure when China goes into Taiwan, everyone will look over there, and I'm sure people will go, okay, who's the Taiwan expert? And they'll go, well, I don't know.
But I do think you're being too modest here, because you of course consider yourself not an expert, but you were good enough to receive an MBA for your Afghan work. You know, I do think you're being a bit too modest, and you've been working now on it for more than 20 years.
Yeah, well, no, you're absolutely right, Johnny. All I'm saying is that, you know, I had a lot of professional experience looking at crisis zones and conflicts, and you know, so you rely on that sort of background analytical experience, and you just dive in and you read and you research and you speak to people on the ground where you can, and you know, I spend a lot of time nagging my bosses and my bosses' bosses to be allowed to get out there, to spend as much time on the ground as I could, just to, you know, absorb and get a sense. You know, I'd never set foot in Afghanistan before. I didn't know that much about it, but it's definitely possible. You know, if you're given a task, you've got to find out about this country. You've got to be able to brief a general or a politician or a diplomat. You've got to be able to brief them, you know, in a couple of days' time. You immerse yourself, and it's a painful learning curve, but it's not impossible. But I think the wider point I'm trying to make, and this is, every so often I give a lecture at Malmö University, like as a guest speaker, we talk about Afghanistan. And what I really learned from that time is, at the time when an international crisis blows up, and then in 2001 it was Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, but it could just as well have been the Balkans before that, and it's certainly Russia, Ukraine now, and it could well be China, Taiwan, or, you know, it could be North Korea. I mean, at a time when a crisis erupts, normally it takes everyone by surprise, and normally there aren't a lot of analysts, or they're spread very thinly. So at a time, so my contention with Afghanistan 20 years back is, at the time when some of the most important international decisions are made by the Americans, by the Brits, you know, do we attack, do we invade, do we do airstrikes, do we just do nothing, do we, you know, there's a whole range of strategic options you can take. At a time when these sort of big decisions have to be made right at the start of a crisis, it's at the time when the countries making these decisions probably know least about the country. And that, I know I struggle with that now, and I find that it's still quite a tough lesson that I have to think about. But the early decisions were not driven by a lot of analytical expertise. There was some, and there was a lot of experience. People had worked in conflicts before, and people who had looked at, you know, Al-Qaeda and such like. But that's my main takeaway from that early period. A lot of your decisions, you're making the best assessments you can. You're making the most impartial, independent analysis you can do. But there's at that point, there's a certain limit to the amount of information and understanding you have. That's what I always reflect on that now, after 20 years. And I mean, you're right, I can consider myself, you know, something of an expert now. But for my first, I don't know, two or 3 years, it was unrelenting hard work, reading, all the overtime, all the hours, trying to get into Afghanistan when I could, and trying to understand what is a very complicated situation. Obviously, you know that, and fast moving at the time. And I do remember, and again, maybe this wasn't the right way of approaching it, but at the time, the Brits and a lot of Western Europe, we've been involved in the Balkans, in Bosnia, and had, you know, some experience of like peacekeeping operations. And at the time, there was some kind of thinking that, you know, maybe Afghanistan is a bit like the Balkans, but a bit bigger. You know, they had the ethnic tensions, they had the religious tensions, they had the warlords, they had the sort of the regions, and some of our briefing maps we used to superimpose to give military commanders the context. We would have a map on a PowerPoint slide. We'd have a map of Afghanistan, the outline, and then we would superimpose an outline of the United Kingdom. So, you know, so if Dutch troops are going out, they'd probably have the Netherlands and something like that. You'd have an outline map of the UK, and we'd then put an outline map of Bosnia as well, to give British military, British MOD, British officials, that's that was the kind of reference point that they could start to sort of dig into, to understand, at the very least, to understand the scale of the problem. The scale was much greater than the Balkans. It's much more complicated, much more violent. But that was some of the starting point ways we had to understand it. And I'm sure all the Western European countries approached it in that sort of way. We didn't have many analysts that really knew the region, and you're reaching back into your other analytical experiences, and you're reaching back. What was the last conflict we did? What were the challenges we had then, sort of thing. So
every conflict is, of course, different. And this one has, like we just discussed before we went on to doing this interview, it seems as if, indeed, and that's going to be the main theme of this interview, is, of course, the regional and global impacts of the situation in Afghanistan and how important Afghanistan is. And then we always come back, because it seems as if there is a new great game going on. And we always come back to the official, original great game of long ago, which I think would be a good introduction. And of course, you're not a historian, but you know enough of it. Would be a good introduction to jump off towards where we are situated now. So just for the audience, in a brief, what is the great game? Well, what was the great game?
Well, I think it's what is, Junaid. There've been different episodes of the Great Game, but I guess, again, my caveat is that I'm not a historian on this, but I have read quite a bit. The Great Game, capital G, as we understand it, was this period in the, I guess, the 17th, 18th, 19th century, where Afghanistan was, it was the boundary between a lot of competing regional interests from the north, the south, the east, and the west, and particularly that focused around the British Empire. Back to the empire again, who at that point in time, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire was India. Obviously, this is before Pakistan, so all that region was India, and it was a very lucrative possession for Great Britain. And I have to make sure I don't say we all the time, because that's losing my impartiality. But the British Empire was I mean, it's a serious point there, Junaid. Sometimes, you know, you have these. It's what I learned in, you know, analyst school. You have these unconscious biases that can affect your analysis. And so,
you're also a member of the British Empire, so that makes it even more difficult.
Yeah. Well, sometimes most of the battle is being aware of your weaknesses and your biases, and yeah. So yes, we've already exposed my sort of contradictions. But the British Empire was exceptionally keen to preserve and protect the boundaries of the empire and not allow external interference. And I guess the biggest concern at that point was the Russian Empire, which was, particularly in the early mid 19th century, so the 1800s, was expanding southeast, you know, if you like, from Moscow, what we now know as Central Asia, expanding towards India. You know, every couple of years, 5 years, 10 years, the Russian Empire, they would absorb, or they would bring into their sphere of influence another a khanate, a little warlord region, a principality, a prince area. So they were slowly, you know, when you look back at it over a few decades, they were getting closer and closer to India. And the Russian Empire was seen, you know, I think rightly, but was seen as a great potential threat to the British Empire. So there were a lot of military and political machinations from the British part and the Russian part to try and establish a ruler in Afghanistan that was favourable either to the British or to the Russians, depending on which diplomat was doing the manoeuvrings, to try and ensure that Afghanistan was a secure, stable, and favourable to the British. And this, I mean, because of Afghanistan, it was more of a region of different like we use the word warlords now, but it was different regions and different powerful princes, khanates and such like. So it was always a bit tricky to kind of get one ruler that was suitable to the British or to the Russians. Whatever. We'll talk about the British. The British are mainly driving this. It was difficult to get a ruler, a king that could be put on the throne and say, right, this is the king of Afghanistan, and he's favourable to the British. And kings came and went. They were deposed, or they were assassinated. There were machinations. The brothers were manipulating. So it was an intense, great game, and there were British politicians in and out of Kabul trying to bring influence to bear, and there were Russians doing the same sort of thing, and other external players as well. So this kind of great game ended up in several conflicts being fought in Afghanistan. And I mean, from the British point of view, we were involved in 3 wars in Afghanistan. The first one was 1839 to 42, which culminated in the famous massacre retreat, the British Army's retreat from Kabul, this is one of these sort of this is back to your analytical biases. In British mythology, there was one survivor from a force of, I don't know how many it was now. It was several thousand, maybe tens of thousands of British soldiers retreating from Kabul in winter to Jalalabad. And at the end of this retreat, there was only one survivor left. Now, that's not entirely true, because there were several thousand native troops fighting with the British who also survived. But, again, the British Empire kind of mythology at the time was you focus on the Western European man who survived, and therein comes the myth. But it was a massive defeat, and the British sent in another force from India into Afghanistan to crush that rebellion and wreak revenge. Fought another war. Tell me if this history is getting too much for you, Junaid.
I was just
to finish the point. We fought another war in 1879-80, and we fought another, I think, a smaller conflict in 1919. And I'll just tell you my slight comedy anecdote. I think the second time I went to Afghanistan, it was 2002. We were hosted by the British general, who was head of ISAF then, John McCall. And it was before the ISAF headquarters was a massive complex with ice cream machines. It was just kind of tense. And he told us he'd held a dinner for the Afghan government. I mean, warlords. Fahim Khan, I don't know if you remember that name. And he held a dinner on the anniversary of the Battle of Gandamak, which was during this retreat, and it was kind of like the last organised defence of the British Army. I said we then, didn't I? The soldiers were surrounded. They had no ammunition left. They had the bayonets. They fought to the last, and then they were overwhelmed, and everyone was killed. And it's a famous battle honour. I forget which British regiment fought there, but it's a famous battle honour, and the regiment celebrates Gandamak Day when they all stood as a last stand. So I thought it was quite a nice touch. General McCall hosted a dinner for the Afghans for Gandamak Day, so they could celebrate the defeat of the British as well. But the point is that the British General McCall hosting this dinner, and he said, and I think it was to Fahim Khan, he said, General, I do find it rather embarrassing coming to your country as a soldier, in these sort of circumstances, bearing in mind we fought 3 wars in Afghanistan. And Fahim Khan said, but that's okay, because we beat you every time. So I mean you get all these echoes of history, and it is that the great game is that classic period, mid-late 19th century.
And so in a nutshell, it means that for big powers, regional or global powers, Afghanistan's strategic position, and maybe today its vast natural resources, have always been very important. And as you just mentioned, the great game has not ended. It's still going on. Perhaps we will get to the fact that maybe the actors have changed in terms of regional and global powers, because I think it was in 2015, and not many people had written this then, but you had, and I found an article of yours, you write in 2015, you said, China might be looking to step up its involvement in Afghanistan. And if people, the so-called experts of Afghanistan, would have read this in 2015, they would have probably not taken you seriously. But now today, what is it, 6, 7, 8 years later, you've proven you've proven that you were right almost a decade ago by saying that China might be looking to step up its involvement in Afghanistan. Is in this new context, is China in this new great game? Is China Britain?
No, I don't think China is China. I mean, Britain has gone. I think. I mean, we had this 20 years of trying to establish some form of democratic process, which has failed. So I think Britain's. I mean, crudely, I think Britain's interest will wane. We'll want to stay there. Obviously, for human rights, women's rights, the Brits will stay engaged, but we won't be bringing power to bear. We won't be bringing, a large amount of money and a large amount of military presence. That's all gone. China is different, but I mean, to an extent, you're right. But China is there, as was then when I was looking at it. China was playing a very careful game. It did understand the resources that are under the ground in Afghanistan, and if you go back even a few years before that, there was a whole period in the media, I think fueled by the Americans, 2010, 2009, 2011, when they were really highlighting the mineral resources, the natural gas, the resources under the ground, and there was these figures being thrown around, $3 trillion worth of assets, and it wasn't just lithium. It was a whole range of things. And there's emerald mines, and there's gold mines, and there's oil and gas, and there's all sorts of potential. But the Chinese, they established the INAC copper mines. I don't know if that rings a bell. And it was helpful that you invited me to talk at the UN last time, because it forced me to dig back into what China was doing, and it seemed the Chinese have been very careful to avoid any confrontation with the Taliban. I think they kept their heads down.
And just to interrupt here, is the avoidance of confrontation, is that related to its economic interest, or is it related to its security interest in terms of the Uyghurs and a small portion of Chinese land bordering Afghanistan? And as you know, the Uyghurs are of the same branch, the Sunni Muslim branch, which the Taliban adheres to. So is it economic, or is it also security?
Well, yeah, I don't know. It's both of those things. I think at the time with the copper mines, the Uyghur issue, certainly in terms of the international community and the world's awareness, was less of an issue. Mm-hmm. So I think at that time it was primarily economic. I think that might have changed. That might have changed now. But so the Chinese are still very interested in the economic potential. I think the Taliban and the Chinese are both intelligent enough to make sure that the Uyghur issue doesn't become a thing, because the Taliban and the Chinese both need each other for this next stage of the great game. I think this will be beyond copper mines. It'll be the lithium. It'll be things like that. But it hasn't happened yet, and I've seen a lot of the headlines. But there's quite a few. There's a bit of pushback. Really, some of the American analysts saying, well, yeah, there's a lot of excitement about the mineral resources, but it's 10, 15 years on since we've had all this excitement, and nothing has really happened yet. Nothing's really been exploited. So it might be easier now. The Taliban have a better grip on the security situation. Maybe the Chinese can step up a bit. I think they'll both play the Uyghur issue carefully. I think the Taliban are concerned, obviously, but they need Chinese money and the sort of the recognition and engagement that comes with it.
And I was just reading up on it because a lot of things have happened over the past few years, but also this year, like we were discussing. In January this year, Afghanistan's administration, the Taliban, signed a contract with a Chinese state-owned company to extract oil from the Amu Darya basin and develop an oil reserve in the country's northern province. Then you have in April this year, you have China offering the Taliban $10 billion. And as you know, the Taliban is quite in need of cash. 10 billion for the access to the country's lithium deposit, which we talked about, which according to many analysts is worth around 1 trillion. And then just a month later, the Taliban has agreed with the Chinese and the Pakistani, so this triangle, to extend the Belt and Road Initiative to Afghanistan. So do you think that, from what you have written in 2015, China might be looking to step up its involvement in Afghanistan? Has China now seriously arrived in Afghanistan and it's not going to go anywhere?
Well, I think they are trying to arrive. I'm still just a little bit. I know what they want. The resources are there. The fighting is largely finished. The Americans are gone. Now is the chance. But again, when I did that talk for you earlier this year, I became aware how I understood more clearly how poor the Chinese are at doing this sort of thing. Their contracts are very suspect, quite corrupt. They're not open to scrutiny. They didn't handle the iron copper mine deals very well at all. I think they were there for a long time, but didn't really extract much copper. And I think there were question marks then over the quality of the contracts. And also, again, I think this is mainly from Pakistan. They're not very culturally sensitive. But if they bring labourers in and workers in, there's obviously potential for friction. And I think when the Western Europeans went into Afghanistan in a big, the Brits and the Americans, we weren't very culturally sensitive, made a lot of mistakes, but but we were trying very hard to understand the culture and the sensitivities and such like. And the sense I get, again, mainly from looking at some of the examples of the Chinese in Pakistan, is that the Chinese aren't very good at this, and they can piss people off, piss the locals off quite easily.
Is it because this just is it that the Chinese are not very good at it because they care less?
Yeah, I think China's in Afghanistan for China's benefit, and you can say that about any country, But I think China's in there for its benefit. It wants to extract as much as it can mineral resources for its own industries and its own purpose. I think it probably sees the Taliban as quite desperate for, like you said, cash poor. They're desperate for cash, so we can probably sign some quick deals and we can give them a lump of money, but then we can start exploiting it.
Is it easy for a Chinese government? I would say so. I've read this a million times. For example, whenever the West and in previous decades, many analysts used to say, for example, in Pakistan, it's easier to deal with a military governing the country than with a civilian government, because it's too much going back and forth. Is it for an entity like China? Is Taliban also just easier to deal with because you have one guy you go to, you sign it, there are no parliaments, there are no upper houses, there is no
I think exactly that. I mean, the Taliban aren't known for in-depth discussions. They're not known for complicated contracts. And yeah, it'll be one person says it, there'll be a little bit of paper and they can get on with it. I think they can. And the Chinese won't have to worry about environmental impacts and consideration for the local population. They won't have to kind of, you know, play nice with people and say, well, the Taliban have authorized it. The Taliban have got their big load of cash. Maybe the Taliban fighters will be in the area just to provide a bit of security. I'm a bit cautious about China's ability to do this, but I think definitely this is where they're going. This is what they want to do now. This is the potential for China is there. This is a good time for them, I think, because the West isn't going to be there in any kind of, you know, significant amount for a long time.
Okay, and this what we just discussed, it reminds me of something I've written down, the Taipei Times in February, and I would like to have your comment on this, because it maybe encompasses what we all discussed about Chinese involvement there and the region. And it says in an editorial in February 2023, it says China's transactional engagement with the Taliban lacks depth. As it stands today, Beijing only engaged the Taliban in a limited way to address its security concerns. Chinese engagement with regional countries, especially Pakistan, and in the international community on Afghanistan, seems half-hearted and driven by regional competition with India over influence. Is this a correct assessment?
No, I mean, I don't have any massive disagreement with that. And that's why I'm trying to play it a little bit cautious about China's. I mean, the press is now all saying all the lithium, the contracts are being signed, billions of dollars being signed for the Taliban. The Chinese have not made a lot of progress in Afghanistan. So I struggle to see them making some rapid advancement. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is still, back to the bigger picture with Afghanistan, since the fall of the previous government and the arrival of the Taliban, this is still quite a transitional period. I think this kind of five-year period, we're 2 years into the Taliban taking over, you know, maybe another 2 or 3 years, it's still quite a fluid situation. The Chinese will be risking, you know, if they go wholeheartedly into Afghanistan, there are still groups that could target them. And
just like is happening in Pakistan.
Yeah.
But when it says here about regional competition with India, do you think the Indians are interested in playing this great game in Afghanistan with the Chinese?
I'm a bit less sighted on that, to be honest, Junaid. I mean, India, I consider India as part of the great game. Absolutely. And the one time I wrote a paper on this well over 10 years, maybe 15 years ago, when I looked at all the neighbors, all the kind of the regions and the near neighbors as well, you know, Russia and India. They're all part of this process, and Pakistan is in Afghanistan for its strategic depth, and India is in Afghanistan partly to poke the Pakistanis, you know, a little bit of support for the former Northern Alliance sort of groups that, you know, the Tajiks and such. Yeah, I don't know enough about India-China relationships, but yeah, it's all part of the process.
Okay, and now coming back to its other neighbors, you have, of course, on one side you have Iran, which has a Shia majority, which doesn't, you know, augur well with the Taliban's own interpretation, and then on the other hand you have Pakistan, which has considered by many, and you know, I think it's an open secret now after generals and presidents have talked about that the Taliban was cultivated, or this Mujahideen was cultivated by Pakistan intelligence agencies, perhaps a bit supported by Westerners, 4 decades ago. And now you have this new phenomena, which is the Pakistani Taliban. And it seems, and again, I'm basing myself mostly on newspaper reports, but the Afghans that we have interviewed, which you have also watched, it seems in newspapers that the Taliban and Pakistan, the Pakistanis are fighting or are not in agreement over the Taliban's support to the Pakistani Taliban. Do you agree with this? Have the tables turned, or is this another part of a strategic depth which is being played out?
I don't think the Pakistani government have as much control over things as they'd like to believe.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and you said this right at the start. There are a lot of painful ironies now and juxtapositions. You know, now the TTP is in Afghanistan, and it's able to launch, you know, operations into Pakistan. And the other irony is that the Taliban and now the government having to deal with, you know, counter-terrorist operations or to tackle terrorist groups. So Pakistanis won't be able to deal with this. I saw most recently they're making a few pointed comments towards the Taliban government that this needs to stop. But it's the cliche. I mean, Pakistan it's set up groups like the Taliban. It's enabled them. They use it for their own ends, but they can't absolutely control these movements once they're up and running.
That for example, the Haqqani network is still part of the Taliban administration, which is known to be, you know, an extension, as what is it, the American general said, of Pakistan's security establishment.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know how that changes. Yeah, I mean, there's a brutal kind of contradiction in a lot of the processes that we're seeing unfold at the moment. Yeah, you know, maybe the Americans will weigh in with a drone strike or two, and you know, destabilize it further.
And do you think it's a 50-50 share, or how do you see that? You have of course the Taliban, you have the Haqqani network. These are the two biggest. And then you have many, you know, other organizations active in Afghanistan, but these are the two biggest organizations which are administering Afghanistan. How do you see their shareholding in the government?
I might be wrong on this. My sense was that the Haqqani network was no longer as powerful as that. I mean, you talked about a 50-50. I didn't think they were as powerful. I thought this was more about Habatullah Akhundzada and this, you know, the clique of Kandahari religious leaders, and again, I might be a bit out of date with this now, but my sense was that the Haqqani side of things had a much smaller series of influences. I might be wrong.
Okay. The interior minister is still Haqqani.
Yeah.
Okay, you know, and then, you know, coming back to this terrorism conundrum, and of course, as you said, this very, you know, ironic things happening, that it was the Pakistanis who were, you know, engaging or supporting terrorism in Afghanistan, and now the Pakistanis are blaming the Afghan or the Taliban for doing the same back in their country. Again, I read something very interesting on one of your posts, which you have written long ago, but you said that you were part of a seminar hosted by a Danish think tank, I guess, in which the well-known Pakistani military expert Aisha Siddiqa was also there. And one of the myths she described there, which you have included in your article, is that it's a myth to believe that the solution to Pakistan's internal problems was an end to terrorism. Do you agree with that? Is that a myth to believe? Because the West has been concentrating a lot on that lately. The FATF, many other sanctions coming along. Is it the myth that the solution to Pakistan's internal problem, as we see them today, the economic crisis, the political crisis, is an end to terrorism?
Well, I don't see ending terrorism as an achievable goal in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, given the way that the Pakistani government, the military, and the ISI are set up. I don't think it's something that they particularly control and have enough influence over. So I don't think it's going to happen. But if the terrorism ended, it would be a major step forward. It would have a knock-on effect in every aspect of society, on the economic side, social side, the unity of the country. But it's not something that I consider a viable. I don't think it's a realistic proposition at the moment, next 5, 10, 20 years.
So you don't think terrorism ending in the coming decade in South Asia?
No.
And why is that? Is that because of unwillingness? Is it because it's important to foreign policy of indeed the Pakistan government or the Pakistani military? Why is it? Why don't you see it ending?
Well, I mean, again, I guess we'd have to define what sort of terrorism we're talking about, because there's about 20 different strands of terrorism operating in and around the area, all for kind of local or regional or particular issues. I think Pakistan must bear a lot of the blame for the terrorism it's created in this region for its own agenda. It's in Kashmir or in India or in Afghanistan. There are no, and this is my Western European hat on, I guess, but there are no really effective democratic structures in and around the region. I don't see any bodies that can come together and seriously tackle the issue of terrorism. When terrorism is being used by so many governments for so many hidden and grey agendas. I mean, just identifying what are the main problems and the causes is going to be hard enough. It would be, it's like a dream, it's a fantasy, but I don't see anything changing 10, 20 years. I think we'll still be in this sort of area with terrorist factions running around blowing each other up.
And do you?
So that was a very crude way of expressing it, but
It's correct, I guess.
Really negative sense of the future in this part of the world, and it's partly because the Taliban are now in charge of Afghanistan, but it goes wider than that, obviously.
Do you see other groups becoming bigger than in the sense? Well, you don't see terrorism going away in this region, but do you see it growing? You have, of course, the ISKP, you have the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. Do you see these groups suddenly becoming bigger than they are now, or?
I don't know about suddenly, but certainly, I mean, I think Islamic State is the one that worries me most, and I know that the Taliban, I don't know if I want to give them too much credit, but they are very actively and aggressively targeting ISKP in Afghanistan, and it seems to be having some effect. I mean, I've been writing for a while now that I was expecting more, looking at the security situation in Afghanistan and Kabul, and I was for the last few months I've been saying, I expect terrorism attacks to increase in Kabul, around the airport and the government areas. But that hasn't really happened. And I wonder if it is because the Taliban, at the moment at least, are being moderately effective against ISKP. But I don't think it's necessarily something that the Taliban can sustain. And so I guess that's where my main concern would be. It's still that Islamic State operating in the area. Their aspirations are there to collapse Afghanistan again, to bring chaos to bear. That's how they operate best in a failed state. So that remains their aspiration. I don't know how they're doing with recruiting in and around the area, but I still see that as the biggest threat.
And do you see the West, as we talked about in the beginning? Like you said, the West was suddenly interested in Afghanistan after 9/11. Do you see the West becoming interested in Afghanistan, in the region, again, without a 9/11?
Well, I mean, first of all, if Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, and I think it's fair to say they both have a presence in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. If either of them were able to reach out into Europe or America again, because we haven't seen much of that for a few years now, then you would get another strong military, i.e. American response into Afghanistan, but I don't think it would be boots on the ground anymore. I mean, we've seen, just from looking at Russia, Ukraine, we've seen the advancement of drone capabilities, going from strength to strength, to get the drones in, to get the missiles in. So you would see, a lot of that sort of military response. A lot of it depends on what the Taliban do in relation to human rights and women's rights, and the prospects aren't good. And we see all the kind of aid agencies and the money that would normally go to Afghanistan to help the population is drying up. It's much lower, and the tragedy is the aid coming in is much lower, but the need of the people is much greater now, with the whole range. I mean, we're just seeing about the flash floods. We're seeing the economic situation, the healthcare situation. There are massive. They've got population displacement, they've got food shortages. So the people's needs are greater, but the money coming in is lower. I think, yeah, it's for the Taliban to shape it. I mean, I think otherwise Brits, Americans, Europeans are gonna behave with extreme caution in relation to Afghanistan, which is a shame, because the need is much greater. I would say, even
no different from earlier. The Taliban were in power in 1995 until 2001, and I think the West didn't care then also too much about the human rights situation over there, where we had public beheadings and public executions until and unless 9/11 happened. But you also think that the Americans and the West would not be interested in Afghanistan just to contain Chinese expansionism? Would they let is the West just content in letting Afghanistan's natural resources just to be exploited by the Chinese?
I don't know how we, because I don't think there's a big. I mean, the big fear with China is Taiwan, right on the other side of the continent. I'm not aware. I mean, I'm not best placed. I'm not aware that there's concern. I mean, I don't know what you do to thwart China. If China wants to strike deals with the Taliban and start exploiting minerals, I don't think there's much. I mean, the only way, just for taking the Brits for example, the only way you could do that is to engage more closely with the Taliban, more directly, and that would imply making. I think it would imply making a lot of concessions on human rights and women's rights that we're not in the mood to do at the moment. But I don't. I think the main threat with China is Taiwan side of the world. I think, and you might be right. And if China does get in and start pulling this stuff out of the ground, I mean, we're seeing contracts maybe and a lot of talk. We haven't seen much action. Then this may become more of a problem for Europe. But I just don't really know what you do in a situation like that. If the Taliban and the Chinese are happy, I don't know how you really try and prevent that.
And coming back to the terrorism issue, you of course said that the Taliban and the Chinese will, deal with the issue of the Uyghurs cautiously. Do you see these other groups tapping into that, like the ISKP, like Al Qaeda, into the Uyghur issue to upset the
yeah? No, so I was trying to work out what your angle was. Yeah, I think as IS is maybe the best example, but yeah, if you can provoke and poke, it's a great target. I don't know what IS are doing in regard to the Uyghur community. I don't. Again, that's an area that I really don't know much about. But IS in Afghanistan, if you can land a few bombs onto a Chinese facility, that would be ideal. I mean, IS's goal is to collapse a state, isn't it? Is to cause a failed state, because then they can operate with impunity. So if you can drive away investment by targeting the Chinese site or whoever wants to set up, if you can tie down the Taliban government, assassinate a few officials, if you can disrupt Chinese investment. I mean, talks about pipelines and railways in Afghanistan have been around for decades. It was all the talk in the 90s as well. and suddenly nothing's happened, 10, 20, 30 years on. It's because the security situation is volatile. And even when you haven't got a major conflict going on, it's quite easy to blow up a pipeline or a railway. So they'll never be entirely secure. And that's the sort of once you've got some solid defined infrastructure like that, it's a nice juicy target for any kind of terrorist group.
And we've seen it recently, for example, with the TTP and Baloch insurgent groups, which have specifically started targeting Chinese infrastructure, Chinese nationals, which made the Chinese consider their security situation in Pakistan.
And I think and this is back to my theme of China proceeding quite cautiously, regardless of what the news headlines are saying. I think they will be careful about this because, as soon as their presence is known and developing, like you say in Balochistan, and the Chinese, my understanding is that Chinese are not very good cultural sensitivities. So once you annoy the locals, you make it quite easy for people to plant an IED here, there, or fire a rocket at an installation. So they'd have to be very cautious, and they'd be an obvious target, a Chinese institution, an establishment, a facility.
And do you see any role in this region, in this great game? Because I think that has been not discussed as it should be in international media, which is Iran. Do you see any economic security role for the Iranians here? I think they don't get enough credit or enough attention for the role that they could play in this region.
But you're right. I mean, we've just been looking east, and each time I've looked at the Iranian angle, they have a tangled and complex relationship with the Taliban. They nearly went to war with the Taliban in the 90s. So you remember that they killed some Iranian diplomats. But for a period of 20 years, there has been, again, it depends on what press reporting you believe, but the Americans were pretty adamant that Iranians were providing IED technology to the Taliban to allow the Taliban to attack Americans. I think Americans complained about that several times. Maybe that's about 10 years ago. There was a theme of reporting that the Iranians are collaborating with the Taliban. So there's a complex relationship. It's made worse because Iran is one of the main directions for Afghan asylum seekers or refugees, people illegally traveling into to seek work. And the Iranians, again, they don't treat Afghans particularly nicely on the border. They kill people, beat them, exploit them. Every month or so, there's some unpleasant report that the Iranian border guards have shot people, or there's some kind of human rights abuses going on, which will provoke the Taliban in the end. But at the moment, for 20 years or so, I think the Iranians, they've had some kind of tacit relationship with the Taliban. Basically, they both hate the Americans, so there's been some kind of cooperation. Now the Americans are gone, I think the dynamics will change a bit. We have this issue with the border and the refugees, but also that there's also been, I don't know if you picked this up, some disputes about the use of the water and the river, access to waterways down in the south, and Helmand River and such like. So that might generate tension, but I don't know. It's in both of their interests to cooperate, and and there's a lot of parallels. I keep thinking about this as well. I know it's Sunni Shia, which is different, but in many ways, Iran it's very similar to what the Taliban are going to be in Afghanistan. It's a very brutal religious dictatorship that has no democratic principles. I mean, Iran is more sophisticated. They've got a more sophisticated and educated middle class, but there's a lot of parallels between, I think, the way Iran runs its people and maybe the way the Taliban will develop.
And that's which it's interesting you say maybe how the Taliban will develop, because most of the Afghan people and also the Afghan experts I've spoken to, they say that the Taliban won't last in its current form as an administration, because it's not used to it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean that is the that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, and when the Taliban fell, so August, like 2 years ago, and I had a flurry of like news interviews I did, you know, BBC and such like, and I was quite. I mean, I think it's one of my analytical weaknesses that I always kind of assume that there's going to be some kind of slide back into civil war. And when Ahmed Shah Massoud's son, announced the NRF, National Resistance Front, I think several of my interviews I was quite upbeat. I said, well, yeah, this is the start of the process by which the Taliban are removed. But on the other hand, I have to remind myself that when the Taliban were thrown out in 2001, 2002, they didn't offer any kind of credible insurgency for about 5 years, 4, 5, 6 years. You know, we started noticing this when the Brits went into Helmand in 2005, 2006. It suddenly became apparent there was a lot of Taliban infiltration, and that's when the insurgency, you know, went up several levels. So it's one of the most important angles, and I don't know what the answer is. I think it's entirely plausible that the Taliban, I mean, they don't have any of the skills, they don't have any understanding of governance, they don't have any tolerance. They're almost by definition they're anti-science, knowledge, learning, freedom of expression. Using half the population, you know, rather than locking them away in a house, sort of thing. So every kind of part of the Taliban's appearance as a government is massively flawed, and I struggle to see how long it lasts. But so it's definitely a point we can assert. Say maybe 5 years time, 10 years time, I could see them going out. I don't know how they would go. I hesitate to say it'll be a civil war again, but it's definitely one of the possibilities. Yeah.
And what will then happen to these legacy contracts? These you know,
the Chinese ones.
Yeah, the lithium contracts, the oil contracts.
Well, I mean, it just depends. I mean, there are so many directions it could go in. I don't think the Taliban will just. I think if the Taliban are going to be thrown out, it would be a very messy conflict, probably with the NRF and Americans and external factors putting weapons in and assistance, but not many boots on the ground. So that might imply this drags out over a long period, rather than, I mean, the reason the Taliban fell in 2001 was because the Americans leaned in very quickly and powerfully with the B-52s, you know, the cruise missiles, and the Taliban cracked, and then they fell apart really quickly. Now, if you're not going to get that level of intervention, and it's left to NRF and a few other factions, this might be, I mean, it'd be like the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Everyone's expecting a rapid resolution, but it could drag on for years. If the Chinese have got contracts on the go there, then who knows? Who knows what will happen? I mean, if there was some form of marginally democratic government in Afghanistan that the international community can support, you know, maybe there's a case for saying, well, okay, the Chinese signed these contracts and we should honour them, you know, as long as they're not corrupted in some way. I mean, maybe you should scrutinise the contracts a bit carefully before you sign up. But if the Chinese have signed contracts, who knows? Maybe you know, a new government would be honour bound to accept them.
Okay. No, we have. I think this is very interesting because we have discussed, of course, one issue which is not discussed that much, which is Iran, and now we have discussed China. Do you still feel, coming back to, you know, the other neighbors in the neighborhood, do you still feel Pakistan is able to pursue its strategic depth policy in Afghanistan? Will it still continue to do? Or...
Yeah, whether it can or whether it will continue to try are two radically different concepts. I think it will continue to bring as much influence to bear on the Taliban as it possibly can. to make sure there is, inverted commas, a pro-Pakistan government to its west. Now, I think they understand that it doesn't work like that. And I remember, where's my other book? This one. This is Abdul Salam Zaif's. Sorry, I don't know if you're familiar with that one. But he had some really, he's one of the original Taliban. He had some really interesting thoughts on the way the relationship was with the Taliban that were inside Pakistan, and they obviously had the links and connections to the Pakistani government, the ISI, and such like. But there was a lot of frustrations and tensions because, as far as people like Zaif, the key Taliban, the Pakistanis do not own us. They do not control us. We are our own people, and we'll do our own thing. And now the Taliban have their own country as well. They're not so dependent on safe havens in Pakistan. The Taliban are emboldened. They took over the country in a matter of days. So I think their inclination to be beholden to Pakistan is much less than it was, even just 2 or 3 years ago. So Pakistan will absolutely, strategic depth. It's burnt into its heart and soul for the ISI, isn't it? Again, this is back to if terrorism ended in the region, what benefits it would have if Pakistan and India could both become slightly more mature and have some serious engagement and get rid of this this pettiness. Who knows what would be possible in the region? But for the moment, 10, 20 years, let's put it this way, 10, 20 years is a very short time in the great game, isn't it? I mean, we've been playing this game for 300 years.
Yes.
And some of the players come and go, but the themes, the issues are still almost identical about the power and influence and resources and access.
And do you then see the other, not direct neighbor, but next door neighbor with this strategic depth? Because the strategic depth of Pakistan is of course related to Afghanistan, but it has its larger implications towards India as well. So how do you see India getting dragged into this again? Because as you know, both the countries, India and Pakistan, have not been on talking terms for quite a while now. Do you that there has been some level, and mostly that's because of Pakistan being cash strapped, maybe under the radar of the FATF, and of course India's much more assertive security doctrines which they have adapted. But do you see a return to, as you say, terrorism will not end? There is a strategic depth which will be pursued. Do you see India being dragged into that again? Do you see another wave of terrorism directed towards India or Kashmir, maybe?
I mean, the short answer is that I don't know. I haven't seen anything which suggests there's going to be an upsurge in terrorism. But sometimes I generally cut India a little bit of slack. I tend to put most of the blame on Pakistan and Pakistan's engagement.
Well, it would help, of course, if that were to happen. It would, of course, help what we discussed in the beginning, the Chinese position in the region. This competition over influence between the Chinese and the Indians. If India could be again dragged into this conflict with the Pakistanis and terrorism, it would of course cement China's position in the region.
Yeah. I don't know what the answer is, but all I can say with certainty, Junaid, is this. I mean, it's a great game. It never stops. It maybe slows in pace a bit and goes in different directions, but yes, China, Pakistan, India, it's going to be continually evolving. People are going to continually poke each other, and Afghanistan, as we've seen many times over the decades, Afghanistan will be a playground for that three-way. I'm pointing in the wrong bit of the screen. The triangle, the three-way triangle of India, Pakistan, and China. And my concern is that Afghanistan will remain a little playground, a part of this bigger great game.
So what
and
if
it won't be to Afghanistan's benefit.
so we're coming to the end of this interview, and we've discussed the great game. And this is maybe, you know, don't consider it as a trick question, it's not. But as I've learned, games always have at the end, it ends somewhere. There's a winner, and then the game ends. Is it the same with this game? Or is this game just going to be played without an end, without a winner? It's just going to change the actors and maybe a little bit of the geography, but it's going to be continued.
It's the latter one, Junaid. This never ends. It shapes and mutates. I mean, there's lots of other parts of the world where you can see these things don't change. You know, you can't change your neighbours.
Mm-hmm.
And every country in that region, every neighbour of the neighbours, they've all got their own strategic issues. They've got their own agendas. I've read some really good analytical books which say if you strip everything down, if you look at the geography of a country, the shape of a country, the mountains, the rivers, the deserts, and you look at the resources that it has, whether it's forest or agricultural land, everything comes down to that. You are shaped by the type of country that you have, the climate, the geography, the resources, and that never really changes. So you're always driven by the same issues. Like the Durand line, it's that whole mountain range is going to be there forever, and that's why different groups of people can infiltrate and go backwards and forwards. That's why you have a Pushtun tribes on both sides of that, and no amount of, and we can blame the British Empire again, no amount of people saying, well, this is the Durand line and this is Afghanistan and this is Pakistan. It doesn't matter, because the geography of the place dictates otherwise. You've got different tribes in different groups, and people go backwards and forwards, and people don't recognize it, and that's why you have the friction and the tension. Which part is Pakistan, which part is Afghanistan, and you get smugglers, and more recently you get terrorists going backwards and forwards. The geography doesn't change, so a lot of the strategic issues don't really change. Sometimes the strategic issues change because technology has changed, and we no longer want coal, we want oil, and then we don't want oil, we want lithium or something like that. So there'll be some kind of rebalancing. But this is a game that, I mean, it never ends. It's a dance, but it's the same for the rest of the world. Brexit is one example of Britain being an island just off the coast of Europe, and it's never been entirely Europe. And back in the day, we used to have part of the empire called this place America as well. So part of Britain is looking at Europe, and part of it is looking west to America. And Brexit is just another example of us working out our great game, our relationship between Europe and the Americas. That's one way of maybe it isn't that, maybe I just made that up. But if you look at different parts of the world and look at the geography, you can start to understand what the strategic drivers are. And in Afghanistan, you look at the country itself, what it's made up of, how it's evolved with its different ethnic groups, and you look at the neighboring countries, and you look at the resources, and you can just say that there's no end point. There's no end point that for 1,000 years this sort of thing will keep going on, and actors will come and go, and the resources and priorities will shape a bit, but it's still so maybe that's too bigger picture, the next 1,000 years. But I don't see in our lifetime any particularly new end state, unless I don't know what would achieve that, some kind of major peace deal. If Afghanistan, if the Taliban were removed from governance, and there was a credible democratic government, however flawed, that would go some way towards stabilizing the region, but not by much, I don't think, because Pakistan has still got its problem with depth. I've become, as I've got older, I've become less optimistic about the world, I think.
You've become experienced, and now you know how the world works.
Yeah.
I think the younger people are much more, there's this idealism, which might take them towards being more optimistic about the future.
Yeah, but you absolutely need that, though, Junaid. I mean, I've gone through the process. I started off as a young man looking at, history and politics and international relations with a lot of optimism. And I thought that, the UN is a really powerful force. It can do a lot of things. But now, not just with Afghanistan, I've looked at the Balkans as well, and now more recently looking at Eastern Europe, and Belarus, and Ukraine and Russia. It's so much more messy and complex and ugly.
Yeah, like you said, I think all these great games dictated by political interests are going on everywhere, and also at the UN and other places. So indeed, but like these are still the only places where we can knock the doors and try to explain and make a difference. Mr. Foxley, thank you very, very much for this extremely interesting interview. I already knew before we started that we're probably not going to get all the answers, but at least there is at least we have tried to put in together a thought process of where and why we come to certain conclusions. It for me, it has been I think we have talked many times, but this is one of the very most interesting 1 hour discussion I've sat with you.
Well, Junaid, well, likewise as well, because I was hoping I wasn't going to just talk all the time, and it's been a really good interactive process, and you've challenged me and forced me to rack my brains, and there's a lot, and I realize now that there's a lot of things I don't know about, or I need to check up on, or I need to update myself on.
Well, you have a few months time, because after a few months you might be invited again by us to a conference or an event we're doing. So
well, I remain extremely happy to take part. It's been, as I say, it's not just me giving stuff. It's you guys pushing me and challenging me, making me think about things in different ways. So it's a classic example of a two-way benefit.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll speak soon.
Yeah. All right. Take care, Junaid. Good to see you. See ya.